This is part two of a four-part series on Jordan Peterson. Part one was done on Jordan Peterson transcending tribalism and cloistered virtues. Part two, which we'll be looking at today, is Jordan Peterson and ideology, liberal orthodoxy and reflective heterodoxy, and then we'll reflect a little bit on his recent book, 12 Rules for Life, which is sort of a Peterson for Dummies, a book or an introduction to Peters and his bigger volume, which came out in the late 90s, Maps Meaning. I've deliberately started with the language of orthodoxy, and heterodoxy, and what some could say also heresy, because most of us assume naively, and unhelpfully so, that the language of orthodoxy, heterodoxy, heresy, it's religious language, it's theological language, it's what defines Christianity in terms of the standard establishment position, and those who differ with it in one form or another are heterodox, and the further you go down that pathway, you're a heretic. So the tendency to think that this language of orthodoxy, heterodoxy, and heresy is religious, theological, ecclesial, liturgical, call it what you will, is essentially embedded in religious thought. But in fact, the way of seeing the world is not necessarily in that language religious. It's a way of defining who is in and who is out, who's on the margins, who's at the core, who are the guardians of culture, who are the guardians of an ideology, a worldview, and what happens when people come to question that, and how are they treated publicly via writing, media, and a variety of other ways. Now, the culture that we live in, particularly in the West, Canada is seen as one of the more progressive, what's called Hegelian countries in the world, is at the forefront of what's called progressive liberalism, with its laundry list of issues, and particularly many of those issues are embedded in universities, courses, degrees, particularly in the humanities and the social sciences, in which people are grappling with what do we mean on gender issues, identity issues, LGBTQ issues, Islam, and a variety of issues like this. And so depending on where a person stands in the cultures wars, as it were, the liberal progressive have tended to, at university, not totally, but have tended in terms of the humanities and the social sciences to come to define interpretations of reality, social reality. Those who dare to differ with them are often heterodox. And Jordan Peterson, in this sense, has dared to call into question the reigning orthodoxy of liberalism, and he has felt the ire, the slings and arrows have been shot his way as a result of just critically questioning a certain secular orthodoxy when it comes to the hot button issues in the culture wars. As in any religious tradition, the Orthodox are marginalized, they're pilloried. Worst case scenario, of course, when, depending on how things work out, people can be killed in these sorts of issues, tried, burned as heretics. We don't do that in benign, liberal, tolerant cultures. We just caricature, demonize, dismiss people, but we do keep them from the center of culture in that sense. So the guardians of a liberal culture, of which Jordan Peterson has come to challenge as the dominant worldview, have seen him as problematic or heterodox and bordering on the heretical almost, because there's certain questions you're not supposed to ask if you're in the royal palace, as it were, the cathedral of liberalism, and the high priests and the cardinals and the popes, as it were, of this particular world. When you question it, you're seen as offending, betraying the tribe or the clan in that sense. So I'm using the language of liberal orthodoxy, heterodoxy, and heretical. I'm wanting to apply it just not in the religious context, but how people think ideologically. Because ideology is about people attempting to often shrink the world to their interpretation and understanding, and if people don't fit within that, then they're usually marginalized. I'll give you two illustrations, and then I'll move into a full discussion of Jordan Peterson, but it's these illustrations will illuminate the reasons why, to some degree, people think just in binary terms, left, right, right, wrong, It's very either or, not both and so a more dialogical or dialectical way of thinking is trumped by a more dogmatic way of thinking. And it's a dogmatic way of thinking that prevents meaningful discussion. And people, as I said, they surround the wagons with their ideology, and if you disagree, then out come the arrows and guns, and the firing begins in the OK Corral in that sense. Two illustrations. 1960s, after World War II and the terrible treatment of the Jews in the Holocaust and Nuremberg trials, in the early 1960s, Israel managed to find Eichmann, and they put him on trial in Jerusalem. Most assumed, obviously so, that he would be seen as the quintessential demon who would be tried and executed, and there would be no questions asked. It was just a fait accompli how this was going to be done, and he was seen as the metaphor of all that was evil in Germany, German concentration camps, and all of that. Now, a very important Jew attended that particular trial of Eichmann, Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt was there in the early 60s, and it's not certainly that she was certainly no supporter. She was a victim of what happened in the 1930s. She had to flee to France and then ended up coming to the United States and became one of the most preeminent political philosophers, really, of the 20th century. But she attended those trials, and she began to ask questions about how the trial was taking place, how people viewed Eichmann, even how potentially Jews were complicit in elements of what happened. Now, these were questions you were not supposed to ask from an Orthodox Zionist perspective, because the Zionist perspective in Israel was that Eichmann was evil, what he had done was unconscionable, and the trial was an attempt to make that clear. Hannah Arendt, being a Jew, so she was a part of the tribe, began to raise suggestive questions, or questions that weren't comfortable, or not seeing him as a demon, as it were, with a tail and horns, but reflected, how could someone do something like that? And are we trying a demon in one sense? Or is this a person who's just so banal, they don't think? And the irony here, she draws this important idea of thinking from Martin Heidegger, who actually, interestingly enough, Jordan Peterson draws from quite a bit in his thinking, which I'll touch on later. Fascinating blend of Heidegger, Bible, and many myths. Also, he's someone like a bit of a rabbit, leaping intellectual rabbit running across the terrain of time. But Hannah Arendt began to say, well, just as Eichmann didn't think about what he was doing and the consequences, to what degree are, in this particular situation, the Orthodox Zionist perspective not thinking in a more serious way about how the trial is taking place, some of the questions he's raising, some of the ways the Jews could have potentially been implicit in what they're doing, alternate ways of doing things. And of course, the way ideology worked here, you're not supposed to ask questions, no more than people today are supposed to ask questions of the state of Israel. So she became marginalized, pilloried, heterodox in that sense, and we can see how this plays itself out. So her community, which had defined what orthodoxy was in terms of political Zionism and how they were to treat Eichmann, when critical thinking began to take place, the irony is that the Jewish community stopped thinking just as Eichmann stopped thinking, and Arendt merely asked them to think in terms of how the trial was being handled, and could have been handled definitely, well, certainly in no way justifying what Eichmann had done. And so you can see where you have an Orthodox perspective, and those who dare to criticize it are marginalized, shunned, as Hannah Arendt was. One more illustration. 1987, when I was doing my doctoral studies, a very well-known American political theorist, Alan Bloom, published his book, The Closing of the American Mind. And what he did is he just raised the question, is historic education in philosophy and political science was about studying the great canon of Western literature and the perennial themes in Western literature, and how certainly in an accelerated way since World War II, in many universities, those great classic texts were not taught anymore, or they were not taught in a meaningful manner, and a lot of trendy texts and politically correct texts were brought in. Now, what of course happened to Bloom, again, the Orthodox liberal establishment that basically said, well, the canon is something we must grow beyond. It's the place of dead white males. Why would anyone want to listen? It's an oppressive tradition. It's a power imbalance. So we have to turn against that whole tradition of literature and bring in a variety of new types of texts that more properly reflect the world we're going and moving into. And so you have this liberal orthodoxy in terms of what text should be taught at university. Someone like Alan Bloom says, in fact, by increasingly excluding or minimizing or distorting how you read those texts, the American mind is closing in on itself in the smallest circle turns. Well, can you imagine those even very daring to ask that question? Out of that came the choir of the Orthodox, the liberal Orthodox, said, no, if we're going to be trendy and progressive, in fact, we have to accept a certain way of seeing the Western canon, mostly in a negative way, and we then have to embrace a whole range of other texts. Bloom was accused, as was Arendt, in different way. In his case, he was accused of being a reactionary conservative, because if you just think in binary terms, then if you're not liberal, and if you're not genuflecting to the texts in the new canon that should be taught, then you must be a reactionary conservative. Now, Bloom certainly was not. He'd done immense work on Plato, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and many of the great crafts in which he looks at the conversation or the dialogue or the dialectic in terms of the big perennial themes in Western civilization or the canon of Western thought. And it is that way of thinking underneath it that he would have hoped then would emerge in terms of how new texts are brought in and how they're taught at university. But what you get is this dogmatism sets in rather than a dialogical or a dialectical way of thinking. And then you have two tribes. Okay, you have the liberal Orthodox tribe, which defines itself as the guardian of all that is good and true and beautiful. And then you have the reactive conservatives that want to go back to the canon, which they see is purely oppressive and not dealing with multicultural issues, obviously African history, Middle East, a whole range of other issues, and those are legitimate questions. But when it becomes either or, again, one is into a binary way of thinking. Now, Jordan Peterson, in one sense, has suffered exactly the same ideological fate that Hannah Arendt suffered in terms of the Eichmann trial, after she published Eichmann in Jerusalem, and exactly the same fate that Alan Bloom suffered when he published The Closing of the American Mind. And underneath it, you can see how you can get these tribes or these intellectual clans. In our time, obviously, with Jordan Peterson on the front stage of larger cultural issues, when he's dared to raise the issues of, say, feminism or neo-Marxism, or postmodernism, some of his ongoing emergence now, he's beginning to engage the question of Islam and a variety of other things. The way he raises it critically is savagely attacked by the liberal Orthodox, and he is seen as heterodox because he dares to ask critical questions. Does that mean he is a fan, an apologist? Does that mean he is the new missionary of the alt-right, the light-right? He has consciously and consistently, again and again, clarified the fact that, in fact, he is very critical of the light-right, the alt-right, and he's equally critical of even the more thoughtful conservatives. So he stands in this, what we would call this middle way, or via media intellectually, between two ideological tribes or clans. And he's quite willing to admit there is good, there is insight in the best of the liberal tradition, but he's also quite willing to interrogate that tradition. In that sense, he's what we would call just a classical liberal intellectual who believes that critical thinking, that sword swings both ways. It not only swings in the direction of issues we don't want, but it swings back and cuts into our own way of thinking. And so between these, those who just think in terms of either or, right, wrong, 1 and 1 equals 2, and they can only think in binary categories and dogmatic categories, in that sense, they're no different. They're just a secularized version of religion that defines who's in the castle, who's on the outside, and How do you treat those who dare to critique the king in his castle or the queen in her castle, whatever that's going on? Now, recently, just a few months ago, his new book, Jordan Peterson, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos, has come out. And as expected with Jordan Peterson, as was happened to Alan Bloom and Hannah Arendt and many others, you tend to get those who are the boosters, the cheerers, those who uncritically see this as the big breakthrough work, which is raising very significant questions. And you also get the knockers, those who demonize him rather than the hagiography group. Probably important to note in the 12 Rules for Life, it's really an expansion in many ways, in a more popular way, of his much more older and more substantive work, Maps of Meaning. And those who excessively isolate 12 Rules of Life and Antidote to Chaos from Maps of Meaning, it would be a bit like in Erasmus's adages, or Hermann Hesse's fairy stories, or Tolstoy's stories for children, of reducing these great thinkers to one book, which is written in a more popular way to be a portal to draw people into the bigger meaning. So very important, I would say, when reviews are being done on Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, to see it as a portal and a pointer into the bigger house of his thinking. So those who want to take seriously what Peterson's doing in a more meaningful manner, they should see that as just a key in the ignition book, from which then they would move on to Maps of Meaning, from which then they could get the more substantive thinking, of which Peterson labored actually for quite a few decades in trying to make sense of how he, as he ventures forth into the modern world, how he makes sense of it. Now, what are some of the bigger themes that Peterson has tried to grapple with in terms of the 12 Rules for Life, and then more significantly Maps for Meaning? He talks from the position that there are two almost primordial or primitive tendencies that exist in the human journey, beyond just technical skills or making it through life. And he finds that these great tendencies are embodied in the great myths of the world. He was quite a student of comparative mythology in many ways. And he says the two of these are the need for order and the reality of chaos. And he sees the middle place as that of the logos, or consciousness, in trying to navigate between these tendencies. Now, what do we mean by order, and what do we mean by chaos? And then what is the role of the logos, or consciousness, in stick handling through these? Well, first of all, there's two levels in order, and there'll be two levels on chaos we'll briefly look at. One of the level of order, the tendency of all of us is we try and make sense of the world. Why is the world the way it is? Is it a world of moral cause and effect? If I live a good life, then there are going to be good consequences. Prosperity will occur, the family will be healthy, political situations will thrive. And if people accept that at an intellectual level, then the question always becomes, well, what happens when the unexpected occurs? When chaos interrupts, as it were, when there's tragedy, when a child dies, or when a husband is ill, or a wife betrays them. There's a multiplicity of things. And so the order in the mind becomes very, very disrupted by chaos that is coming in, and then a person has to totally rethink the map of meaning in their head and the myths that they have accepted. And so it's in this life is this clash between, on the one hand, intellectually trying to make sense of the world and interpret it, and then new evidence and information coming in that can undermine that very order itself. And in this tension between chaos and order, consciousness, or the logos, has to find its way. In the political sphere, of course, we constantly try and create order. We like streets that work. We go down one side of the street, some goes down the other. We want to be on time for classes. We want a class to be orderly. You hope your business is running orderly. And so the whole nature of a civilization is built in trying to have some sort of predictable order by which people can be free and feel safe. Now, of course, if you push order too far, either politically or intellectually, you get ideology, okay, in which my interpretation of life is absolutely right, and if you disagree with me, then you threaten the worldview that I'm articulating. Politically, if you push order too far, you're into totalitarianism, and part of Jordan Peterson's, much of his life has been a great concern with both on the right and the left, whether in Nazism or whether in Italian fascism or Japanese nationalism, or on the left, former Soviet Union, or obviously Mao's China and the Cultural Revolution. This is where order goes in a direction which undermines freedom in that sense. And so the task, what Peterson is trying to do, is live in the tension between legitimate order, which births freedom, and repressive order, which undermines freedom. On the other hand, the role of the creative, and one of the myths which often used here is the male-female myth, and what you get Peterson doing, mining these great traditions, including the Bible, Taoism, Veda, and Hinduism, and many of these other great heritages, to look at what's the positive view of chaos, or interrupting culture, or questioning culture. Well, of course, when people are ideologically committed to a certain view, it can be liberal orthodoxy, it can be conservative orthodoxy. When someone comes to threaten it, they bring chaos, they bring uncertainty. And so the natural tendency is to defend oneself by marginalizing those who challenge that, and they then become the heterodox, so they become the heretics. Let me just read one of the opening of maps of meaning to give you a little bit of a feel for, almost mythically, what Peterson was trying to get at in this. And so it's really his Descensus and Infernos, the preface to Maps of Meaning. Something we cannot see protects us from something we do not understand. The thing we cannot see is culture in its intrapsychic or internal manifestation. The thing we do not understand is the chaos that gives rise to culture. This is important to understand, of course, because culture or religion or politics is an attempt to give some sort of order to what is threatening or chaotic, and we have to either intellectually try and make sense of our world, or politically, so it's stable, it's predictable, it's secure. And so culture, again and again, in culture, mandarins, as it were, will protect through a variety of means their own worldviews, because they fear if that's not protected, then you slip into chaos again, okay? And they avoid that. So if the structure of culture is disrupted, unwittingly chaos returns. We will do anything to defend ourselves against that return. So Jordan Peterson comes as chaos, okay? He comes as a disruptor to the culture mandarins, and that can be the cultural mandarins of the left, the ideological left, or it can also be the cultural guardians of the reactive right. And so people will do whatever they can in terms of defending intellectually, culturally, printed way, through the media, their own understanding of reality, because the questions he asks begin to erode the foundations of the house they have built of culture, and they see only chaos. They don't see only chaos threatening. And so someone who thinks in terms of, okay, what's the creative role of chaos in questioning a form of culture which is ideological, and of course, how is someone going to be treated who does that, both on the right and the left? And so, and of course, from chaos is often the feminine image of creativity, a birth of something new coming into being. But those who are wary of anything new, they then will defend and actually kill the newborn child, because they do not want that sort of birth that may disrupt. It may disrupt the culture, the world view that they think best articulates, in this case, where progressive liberalism is going. So in one sense, the beginning of his magnum opus, in that sense, it looks at this tension between order and chaos, the good of order, both ethically, and of course much of 10 Rules for Life is based on what is the form or what is the order that sets us free. Where there is no order, we can think we're free, but in fact we become victims of our own drivenness, victims of our own egoism, victims of our own narcissism and indulgence. And he will argue clearly from a classical perspective, in fact, what are the conditions that create freedom, rather than form being the enemy of freedom. But what is the very framework we need? We all know in all of life you have to have a framework within which freedom, the game of life is played. So whether it's hockey, for example, if someone says I can wear boots on the rink and we can do whatever we want, you don't have to use a puck, you can use a basketball, but you're not free to play hockey anymore. It's the framework, the form that then sets people free to play the game. People say I can drive on any side of the road I like. Well, they're free to do that, but then people are not free to be safe on the road. So what he's looking at in terms of order is trying to get at the difference between legitimate order, from which people are free, and illegitimate order, from which they're oppressed. He's also looking at, particularly in our postmodern world, in terms of chaos, people who elevate the language of liberty and equality and individuality to a point where there's absolutely no sense of orientation in terms of identity, of soul, of gender, of anything that's right or wrong. And so that creates immense fragmentation, and nothing can be, as what Yeats would say, the center cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. So there's good in chaos, but chaos has a downside. So you can see how his nimble mind, as it were, is working and trying to see what is the good of order that in fact births legitimate freedom. So what's the womb of meaningful order that births freedom? What's the downside of order? It becomes totalitarianism. What's the good side of chaos that challenges, as it were, frozen order? And what's the downside of chaos, in which there is no right, there is no wrong, there's just each people make up their own definition of understanding of meaning, purpose, ethics, identity, you name it. That Peterson will argue, is typified in certain elements of university courses, where in fact all things are relative, everything's a matter of enculturation, socialization, anything like that. And so in 12 Rules for Life, he gives you a more popular introduction to legitimate order versus illegitimate order. He also gives you an introduction, the reader, to legitimate creative chaos, but the problems with illegitimate sort of freedom that sees any sort of order or limitation as inhibiting my freedom, and then the consequences. And so the middle in all of this is always the logos, which navigates between legitimate order and legitimate chaos. And this is why you can see in the midst of the culture wars, he will not buy into the left, the trendy progressive left, or the reactionary right, either in its conservative form or its alt-right form. Now, what guides then the logos? What is the North Star? What's the compass that Peterson will use to because if there's no sense of direction or no sense of moral grounding, well, he'll argue that there's such a thing called truth. Okay, and it's very interesting the way he brings together comparative myths. One of the things that's interesting I found in looking at maps of meaning, that he'll talk about always key figures like various types of Jungians, but the person which I found interesting, he didn't reference in maps of meaning, who would have been quite trendy when he was doing all this, and was probably the preeminent lecturer around the world on myths, was Joseph Campbell, and it's Hero with 1,000 Faces and recovering all the great myths and their eternal truths, which really is what Jordan Peterson is doing. But Peterson, in particular in 12 Rules for Life, it's interesting, he references again and again Heidegger and what it means to be open to being. But what does it mean to be open to being? And he'll argue there are such things as truth, goodness, and beauty. Interestingly enough, in one of the chapters here, chapter 2, he does a very extensive, sort of a psychological spiritual read of Genesis, the early chapters, the difference between the Yahwist tradition and the priestly tradition. Chapter 4, he argues, in fact, that the Beatitudes and Sermon on the Mount is the greatest guide in terms of if you want to know what truth is. And so he's engaged in this fascinating, as I mentioned earlier, is a bit like a rabbit running across various parts of the intellectual terrain, but he really believes that as it were, people are properly oriented and the compass in its right place, people like Heidegger, when obviously disconnected from elements of his questionable Nazi past, and particularly the Bible, is essential. Now the question is, as he's turning more and more to interpreting and reading the Bible, how is he doing that? And in the next two segments I'm going to do on Jordan Peterson, I'm going to look at his approach to the Bible, the particular exegetical tendencies he's using, and why it is appealing to so many people. And then the fourth part, I'm going to look at both the legitimacy and perhaps the blindness in him categorically reducing, let's say, the universities to bastions and bunkers of neo-feminism, neo-Marxism, postmodernism, and a variety of other throwaway terms he uses. And in one sense, he's right in what he says, but there's people within universities that are very critical of that also. And I would also argue some of his definitions, or the people he uses in postmodernism, neo-Marxism, neo-feminism, and particularly he's moving more and more into discussing Islam itself. And I think perhaps something that needs to be reflected on, what is his views of Israel and the Palestinians and Muslims, because given some of his tendencies, at this point he and some of his backers, which tend to have strong Jewish influences, it will be very interesting where he goes with the Jewish, Israel, Zionist, Palestinian, Muslim element, because the danger sometimes in him trying to avoid groupthink is he gets into his own groupthink, and he then caricatures, he pillories other people as all thinking the same way, which of course they don't, and he may himself, if he's not careful in some issues, uncritically get hooked in to certain ideological tendencies, and he becomes a form of defining his own orthodoxy, and then those who disagree with him are heterodox and heretical. So I think where we'll be going then, I would encourage one and all, though, in terms of these two books, 12 Rules for Life, and more importantly, Maps of Meaning, which he calls the architecture of belief. If they want to, I think before criticizing Peterson, for those who do, it's absolutely essential that they at least understand what he's up to, and not creating a straw man or a caricature and then critiquing what he's not. And to understand that, you have to understand transcending that tribalism of left-right politically, order, chaos, the understanding of consciousness of logos, his understanding of truth, openness to being, truth, goodness, and beauty. There's a whole range of categories he's attempting to articulate, and he's doing it on the move to some degree too, because he's been catapulted to the front stage in a rather hasty way. So people are asking him questions from such a diversity of angles that he would never have been asked if he stayed in the sort of shadows of the university in the lecture hall. But now, because he's probably one of the most prominent public intellectuals, not only in Canada, the States, obviously in England, and also to be careful, I just noticed Wendy Mesley's recent interview with them. The danger is that she also slipped into a little bit of the Kathy Newman stuff. She'd bring out worst case pictures of him with the Pepe the Frog, and you want to say this should be beneath a national television approach. Both the interviewer should be a little more sophisticated and subtle, because in this case Wendy Mesley is interviewing someone who's a little more sophisticated. So let's raise the level, raise the bar of discussion if we want to raise the level of philosophy, theology, politics, culture, literature, the arts. And so we're not demeaning people in the name of I'm the Orthodox liberal and CBC, and this person's really a troll from the Catskills, and we're just going to prove that's what he's like. That does not lead into a meaningful, civilized and cultured people who are civically engaged in pondering and reflecting upon some of the most trying issues that beset us these days. So the next one I'll do is 2 weeks is Jordan Peterson on the Bible, and then the final one I'll deal with, I'll reflect on the legitimacy of Jordan Peterson's going after postmodernism, neo-feminism, neo-Marxism, his approach to Islam, but also a critique of the way he's also doing that. There's legitimacy in what he's saying. It reveals much, but it also conceals much, which is just not true, the way he's interpreting some key thinkers in each of those areas. So with that, like the Hobbit, I shall disappear.